In November 1922, Wrangell turned out to vote in the general election. Charlie Jones, a respected Tlingit elder, tried to vote but was denied on the grounds that he was not a United States citizen. He left and returned with fellow Tlingit elder Tillie Paul Tamaree, who convinced the election judges to let Charlie Jones vote. Both Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree were arrested for this act of civil disobedience and taken into federal custody. Their arrests brought to a head years of brewing battles between Wrangell's white leadership and native residents. This is the story of what happened in Wrangell before Election Day, on Election Day, and after. The arrest of Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree wasn't just about politics. It was about family. Chapter 1. The Family. Even before Tillie Paul Tamaree was arrested with Charlie Jones, she had earned a spot in the Alaska Hall of Fame. Her life, on its own, is a comprehensive history of Wrangell, spanning almost 90 years, going back before the Alaska Purchase. As a young girl, her faith and intellect caught the attention of the Presbyterian Reverend S. Hall Young. The Reverend needed someone who could translate his sermons into Tlingit. Tillie was half white, half Tlingit, and served as a cultural broker between the two worlds. She went on to become a prolific missionary throughout southeast Alaska. By 1922, Matilda Paul Tamaree was a 59-year-old silver-haired grandmother, living on Front Street in Wrangell in a house her husband, William, built for her. They had 3 daughters 18 and under, Florence, Frances, and Gladys. Tillie had 3 grown sons with her late husband, Louis Paul. Louis and Tillie first bonded over a shared missionary zeal, the fact they were both orphans, and that they were each half native, half white. Louis drowned in 1886 while Tillie was pregnant. He left behind 3 sons, Samuel, William, and Louis, the last named for the father he would never know. The boys were raised under Tillie's devout Presbyterian faith in ways that often discouraged their Tlingit heritage. She sent her sons to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, where the first games of American football were being played. Tillie's eldest son, Samuel, grew up, moved east, settled down with a family, and never lived in Alaska again. The youngest, Louis, joined the army to fight in World War I, but 10 days later, the war was declared over. He was honorably discharged in January 1919, returned to Wrangell, and married Matilda Jones, daughter of Charlie and Susie Jones. This meant Tillie and Charlie were connected through their children's marriage and the 2 granddaughters it produced, Nana and Marion. Charlie and Tillie were also connected through a shared history in Wrangell. In 1922, they were each approaching 60 and had lived through dramatic changes in Wrangell. A Tlingit village they had known as children had turned into a frontier city. They remembered when the army built a fort next to the village, and they remembered the day after Christmas when the fort shot cannons at the village. Like his father-in-law, Louis Paul fished for a living. Seeing how fish traps hurt fishermen like himself, Louis became politically active and rallied the Alaska Native Brotherhood, many members being fishermen affected by the fish traps. Louis moved his family to Petersburg, and by 1922, he was publishing a newspaper to support the cause of Alaska Native civil rights. Louis needed as much help as he could get. He needed someone by his side in Alaska to help wage the campaign. He looked to his older brother, William, down in Oregon. By 1920, William was 35 and had pursued many directions in life. After Carlisle, he attended other schools, even taking 1 year of seminary, but never becoming a priest. In his heart, he wanted to be an opera singer. He sang tenor and aspired to study opera in New York City. But in 1920, he was living with his wife and children in a home in Portland, Oregon, where he worked in insurance. By this point, William was following the path of his older brother Samuel, making his life outside of Alaska. William's younger brother, Lewis, on the other hand, was still in Alaska, active in the Alaska Native Brotherhood, living in their ancestral homeland, and fighting for it. Through regular correspondence through the mail, William Paul had been slowly but surely earning a law degree through LaSalle University, an accredited school in Illinois. The LaSalle University Extension was founded in 1908 and pioneered distance delivery education. One of their ads said, "We bring the university to you. We enable you to obtain a law degree while you hold your present position. This is democracy of education. This is how any man can get a real chance to succeed by securing training which is in demand." William Paul returned to Alaska and took the Alaska bar exam, chaired by U.S. Attorney Arthur Shoup in Ketchikan. He passed the test with flying colors, becoming the first Alaska Native lawyer. William Paul and his brother Lewis wasted no time getting to work before the 1922 election. Chapter 2. Fight for it. In 1920, all in 1 year, William Paul moved his family back to Alaska, became a lawyer, and was elected secretary of the Grand Camp of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, with his brother Lewis as president. The brothers fought the battle on multiple fronts: fish traps, school segregation, and, the key to winning it all, the right to vote. Wrangell was still a small town, less than 1,000 people, and a tightly packed community. And yet, deep racial divisions remained. A growing population of white outsiders was set to eclipse the native population, and official offices and titles were typically held by white men. One individual in Wrangell would play a recurring and decisive role in the effort to thwart the Paul brothers. Leonard M. Churchill was a very important man in Wrangell. He arrived between the Cassiar and Klondike gold rushes in April 1887 at the age of 29. He was a New Yorker by birth, but called Wrangell home for the rest of his life. At first, he worked on steamships, then co-owned and operated a steamship for hauling lumber and mail. When Wrangell officially became a city in 1903, he sat on the first city council. He held a number of official roles and titles, such as deputy customs collector and inspector, watchman, estate executor, election judge, and more. He knew everybody in Wrangell as well. The 1920 U.S. Census for Wrangell was conducted by Leonard M. Churchill and is written in his handwriting. He did it again 10 years later in 1930. He was a founding member of two social clubs, the Improved Order of the Red Men in 1911 and the Wrangell Igloo of Pioneers in 1921. Though the names might suggest Native American membership, these were both organizations for white men that borrowed heavily from Native American symbolism. In 1911, the Improved Order of Red Men named the leader of its Wrangell chapter, "Tribes and Council's degree of Pocahontas, under the jurisdiction of the Great Council of the United States, Alaska Tribes, Stickeen, Wrangell, L. M. Churchill." The Wrangell Igloo of Pioneers formed in 1921. To join, you had to be a white man who came to Alaska at least 20 years before. By and large, that meant men who came during the Klondike Gold Rush. Churchill had been around Wrangell a decade longer than most of the club's members. In 1921, the year it was formed, The Wrangell Igloo submitted a letter to Congress about the creation of a fish commission to regulate fish traps. The Igloo supported the commission, but it explicitly requested that Alaska Natives not be given a spot. Leonard M. Churchill's name was the first printed below the letter. It read, "A bill to create an Alaska Fish Commission meets with our hearty approval, with the exception of the inclusion in the personnel of the board of a representative of the Alaska Natives. We believe that a board composed of well-chosen white men of Alaska will more fairly and effectively protect the interests of the native population than would a body continually beset by the sentimental and impractical arguments of a member whose education at white schools would probably make him the choice of the natives." William Paul offered a rebuttal in person by visiting Washington, D.C. just a few months later in January 1922. He was Alaska Native, a fisherman, and a lawyer. The White Horse Daily Star wrote, "He will be better equipped to talk on fish, etc., more so than anyone who was sent there heretofore, and besides he will have the backing of most of the working class in Alaska." William Paul delivered an attack on fish traps, the Alaska Syndicate, and decades of federal neglect in Alaska. Towards the end of his remarks, he humanized his appeal with anecdotes about fishermen around Wrangell. Among them was Charlie Jones. Charlie Jones, with a crew of 6 men, one of them is almost blind, and following the practice of the natives of Alaska of helping one another, they took this semi-blind man along because he had a family of 6 children and the crew to help him. At the end of the fishing season, they had coming to them $17.70 per share, on which those men must live from the end of the fishing season to the next fishing season. In the 1920s, school segregation in Wrangell was not unlike other places. In 1896, the Supreme Court, in Plessy v. Ferguson, made separate but equal the law of the land. From historian Stephen Haycox. Education in the territory had been segregated from its beginnings in the 1880s, and the refusal of white schools to admit even assimilated Indian children had been an Indian complaint since 1906. In language clearly reflecting William Paul's influence, the 1920 convention adopted a resolution instructing Alaska Native Brotherhood officials to, quote, carry the matter forward to the federal courts as a test case, if necessary to achieve satisfaction. The Paul brothers crafted a strategy to compel the integration of schools in Wrangell. They persuaded the head of Indian schools in Alaska, Charles Hawksworth, to announce that the Indian school in Wrangell would be closed for the 1921 to 1922 school year. That would leave the white school as the only remaining option, effectively forcing the student bodies to integrate. Charles Hawksworth's announcement received strong opposition not just in Wrangell, but around southeast Alaska, and he withdrew his plans to close the native school. The Paul brothers issued a statement threatening to take the Wrangell School Board all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and to sue for every cent paid by Alaska Natives in taxes and fees in Wrangell. The Paul brothers fought the government in public and in court, but they knew the most effective way to defeat it was at the ballot box. Everyone knew Alaska Natives had one huge advantage: numbers. From historian Terrence M. Cole. Natives, however, actually outnumbered the permanent white population of Alaska, and it was not until the late 1930s that whites became the permanent majority. In those pre-war years, pioneer Alaskans often refused natives the right to vote, prayed every Sunday in segregated churches, and sent their children to segregated schools. The Paul brothers traveled throughout southeast Alaska, holding public gatherings. Around the time of the April 1922 primary election, the Paul brothers visited Petersburg. The Petersburg Weekly Report wrote, William Paul stated that every person over the age of 21 born in Alaska has the right to vote and should go to the polls and exercise this right if the natives expect to retain what they have already gained. As expected, Native voters encountered resistance. In the April 1922 primary election, a Tlingit man in Wrangell, George Mason, attempted to vote, but was denied by Leonard M. Churchill. This was precisely the type of discrimination the Paul brothers traveled Alaska warning about. William Paul took Mason's case and waited until the perfect moment to file his lawsuit against Leonard M. Churchill. It was timing that would prove fateful. The day before the general election of 1922, William Paul sued Leonard M. Churchill. From the Petersburg Weekly Report. In what is said to be an attempt to influence election judges in southeastern Alaska, a suit was filed in the district court recently in which George Mason, a native, asks for $5,000 damages for being refused a chance to vote at the primary election last spring. The suit was filed on the eve of election by W.L. Paul as attorney for Mason and is against L.M. Churchill, one of the election judges at Wrangell at the primary election. In today's money, the suit was around $75,000 damage. William Paul wrote about it to his mentor, Richard Henry Pratt. This move on our part, for which our enemies blame me entirely, is creating a great stir here. I hope we lose in the district court so we can appeal it, but I am afraid we will win, in which case the decision is merely local, although even at that it will ensure our rights in many directions. To defend himself, Churchill hired James Wickersham, the famous former judge turned politician turned private lawyer in Wrangell. Wickersham and William Paul were actually allies. Wickersham took the rookie lawyer under his wing, sharing clients and political causes. But in the George Mason case, Paul and Wickersham were opponents. William Paul thought he had his test case, but the very next day would change everything. Chapter 3. Election Day. It was Tuesday, November 7, 1922. James Wickersham noted in his diary that the day was fine weather. On the ballot, citizens of Wrangell voted on a delegate to represent Alaska in Congress, senators and representatives for the territorial legislature, and commissioners to oversee roads. Charlie Jones, 57, walked into the polling place to cast his vote. He encountered 3 election judges, C.E. Weber, 53, Ole Gunderson, 56, and Leonard M. Churchill, 63. C.E. Weber was a carpenter. Ole Gunderson worked on fish traps with his son. Ole Gunderson was a Norwegian immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1882 and became a naturalized citizen in 1893. Charlie Jones asked to vote. In a repeat of what happened to George Mason, he was denied, on the grounds that Jones was not a citizen of the United States. If William Paul had intended to put Churchill on notice by suing him the day before Election Day, it had not worked. Charlie Jones left the polling place dejected, unable to vote. And that's when he just happened to run into Tillie Paul Tamaree. When Tillie was only 12 years old, she was sent away from Fort Wrangell down to British Columbia to marry a much older man against her will. His name, according to history, was Abraham Lincoln. Tillie refused the man and his marriage offer. Abraham Lincoln relented and released Tillie to a Methodist minister and his wife, who taught Tillie English and Christianity. When Tillie returned to Fort Wrangell, she joined Presbyterian missionary Amanda McFarland's Home and Industrial School for Girls, founded in 1877. The school was more than just training and religious instruction. Amanda McFarland provided a refuge for young Native girls who were often targets for minors and early marriages, like Tillie experienced. Amanda McFarland's letters describe many direct, face-to-face confrontations with men in defense of young women, stubbornly putting her foot down, demanding a young girl be turned over to her. In 1922, Tillie Paul Tamaree had not forgotten the lesson. She listened to Charlie Jones tell his story about being turned away at the polls. Her grandson, Fred Paul, describes the encounter like this. "What is the matter, Kootenaik?" she asked him in Tlingit, using his native tongue. "I've just come from the voting place," he replied, "and they won't let me vote." "Come with me," she said. "We are going right back there to talk to them." When they got to the polls, Charlie Jones again encountered the same men who had turned him away earlier that day. The only difference now was Tillie Paul Tamaree stood by his side. In a repeat of the earlier encounter, Charlie Jones asked to vote. Again, Leonard M. Churchill said Charlie Jones did not meet the qualifications to vote because Charlie Jones was not a citizen. Tillie may have admonished the election judges, arguing Charlie Jones had every legal right to vote. She may have pointed out the obvious. Charlie Jones was no alien. He had been in this place longer than any of the election judges or the United States government. Tillie called Churchill's bluff, so he raised the stakes. As an election judge, he had the power to ask voters to swear an oath to their qualifications, an oath as legally binding as one given in court. The oath did not prove Charlie Jones was a citizen. It was still his word against Churchill's. But it gave Churchill leverage. If Charlie Jones declined the oath, then Churchill won. If Charlie Jones took the oath, then Churchill had grounds to charge Charlie Jones with perjury, a felony. Charlie Jones took the oath. "I do solemnly swear that I am 21 years of age and a citizen of the United States, that I am an actual and bona fide resident of Alaska and have been a resident during the entire year immediately preceding this election and have been a resident of this voting precinct for 30 days next preceding this election, and that I have not voted at this election, that this place from which I came immediately prior to living in this precinct was born in Wrangell, in the territory of Alaska, and that I resided in said territory for 52 years, so help me God." If the oath had meant to discourage Charlie Jones, it did not work. Tillie Paul Tamaree watched the election judges hand over a ballot to Charlie Jones, who cast his vote. All the men there had succumbed to the will of Tillie Paul Tamaree. And then life went on. Months passed, from fall to winter to spring, until one day in March 1923, when Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree were arrested. From the Petersburg Weekly Report. Deputy Marshal Campbell has taken into custody Charles Jones and Mrs. William Tamaree on bench warrants issued by the United States District Court and will take them to Ketchikan on the first boat for arraignment. All winter long, a plan was brewing in Wrangell to have them charged. Churchill's authority had been challenged, and he intended to fight back. He enlisted the support of the Wrangell City Council, led by Mayor John Goodwill Grant. In 1922, John Goodwill Grant was mayor of Wrangell, owned the luxurious Fort Wrangell Hotel right off the wharf on Front Street, and was one of the most powerful men in town. A Nova Scotian by birth, he had come to Fort Wrangell during the Klondike Gold Rush. He turned to business, starting in coal, amassing property and wealth along the way. Mayor Grant was a successful businessman and a notorious bootlegger. In 1919, he pled guilty to possessing alcohol, but got the charges of furnishing alcohol to natives dismissed. A prohibitionist who traveled through Alaska openly accused Grant of hiding caches of alcohol around the area. When Wrangell voted to go dry, he went to court to try to defeat it and have his alcohol license restored. Leonard M. Churchill and Mayor Grant had something else in common. They both married Wrangell women with Alaska Native ancestry and produced large families. John Goodwill Grant's wife was Mary Lynch, the daughter of E.P. Fred Lynch, one of Wrangell's prominent businessmen, and Susie Young, an Alaska Native woman. It was Fred Lynch that introduced John Goodwill Grant to the hotel business. When Fred's son and Mary's brother, Charles Lynch, was arrested for murdering Japanese immigrant Harry Nakamoto in 1921, John Goodwill Grant posted bail and collaborated with the defense attorney, James R. Wickersham. At trial, prosecuted by U.S. Attorney Arthur Shoup, a jury found Charles Lynch not guilty. In Grant, Churchill found an ally. Together, the election judges and the Wrangell City Council petitioned U.S. Attorney Arthur Shoup to prosecute the case. In March 1923, Shoup convened a grand jury in Ketchikan. He presented 3 witnesses from Wrangell: William G. Thomas, the U.S. Commissioner, Ole Gunderson, one of the 3 election judges, and John Goodwill Grant, mayor of Wrangell. The men testified to the facts, including that Charlie Jones was illiterate. There was no literacy test to vote in Alaska, yet it was often used against Alaska Natives as evidence of being uncivilized. If you could read and write English, you were considered civilized. Never mind that Charlie Jones was born in Wrangell when it was still a Tlingit village. Never mind that on the 1920 census, Churchill, by his own hand, checked the boxes indicating Charlie Jones could read and write. The effect of this unwritten literacy rule was to exclude Alaska Natives from voting. From Stephen Haycox. Most of the Indians in Southeast Alaska, however, still were illiterate. Perhaps Paul's most controversial act was to organize illiterate voters as well as literate ones, a fact which probably helps to explain the increase in Indian voting statistics. To ensure that Southeast Natives would know how to vote, as well as whom to vote for, Paul prepared sample ballots and cardboard cutouts which would cover all but the appropriate boxes when placed on the actual ballot. By placing an X in the squares showing through the cutouts, illiterate Indians could be sure of voting for Paul's choices. Most Indian votes in the 1922 election went for Sutherland, though just how many Indian votes there were would be a matter of continuing dispute. Opponents would argue that Paul controlled at least 1,000 illiterate Indian votes. His supporters would argue that the number was only a few hundred. After hearing the testimony, the grand jury returned secret indictments, leading to bench warrants for the arrest of Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree. Writing in Sold American by Donald Craig Mitchell. According to William Paul, the jury did so because the Wrangell City Council had decided that Jones was the best defendant to prosecute to obtain a court ruling that illiterate Tlingits were not citizens. Charlie Jones was charged with illegal voting and perjury for the oath he had sworn to Leonard M. Churchill. The illegal voting charge alone was up to a $250 fine and 6 months in jail. Tillie Paul Tamaree was charged with inducing an Indian not entitled to vote, a $500 fine and 3 months in jail. The indictments were silent on exactly how Tillie Paul Tamaree induced Charlie Jones to vote. Her name does not appear anywhere in either of Charlie Jones's indictments, suggesting he acted of his own free will. Perhaps it was embarrassing to describe, on the record, how a petite elderly grandmother had bent the men to her will. As the ship set course from Wrangell to Ketchikan, Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree sat in the custody of the U.S. Marshal, awaiting their arraignment in court. Chapter 4. Trial. From William Paul's son, Fred Paul. My father was in Juneau when he read of the indictment in the local newspaper, and he took the first steamer to Ketchikan. He met his mother and Charlie Jones as they arrived in Ketchikan in U.S. Deputy Marshal Campbell's custody. "Thank goodness you're here," said Campbell on greeting him. "I didn't know what I was going to do with your mother." Campbell was a decent man, and he did not like to think of Tillie Paul Tamaree being incarcerated with common criminals. Both Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree appeared before a judge and posted bail, thanks to 2 Ketchikan men, one of them a minister. The trial was set for October 1923, with Charlie Jones going first. If he could prove his innocence, then no crime had been committed, and the charges against Tillie Paul Tamaree would have to be dismissed. There was too much riding on the Jones case to lose. William Paul felt he had to dismiss George Mason's lawsuit against Leonard M. Churchill. While Churchill might have been glad that the lawsuit was dismissed, he was still out at least $100 to his lawyer, James Wickersham, and he may have been shocked when he heard Wickersham took the case of Tillie Paul Tamaree for free and Charlie Jones's case for $500. The months passed before the trial began. During that time, Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree became grandparents all over again, as Louis and his wife Matilda welcomed a son, Louis Francis Paul Jr., the month before the trial. In October 1923, almost a full year after his vote, the trial of the United States versus Charlie Jones commenced in Ketchikan before Judge Reed and a jury. Charlie Jones could not afford to pay James Wickersham's fee, so William Paul stepped in to represent Charlie Jones at no cost. U.S. Attorney Arthur Shoup presented the government's case. Just a few years before, he administered the bar examination that William Paul had aced. Now they faced each other in court. The trial was William Paul's chance to save Charlie Jones, spare his mother from going to trial, and establishing the right of Alaska Natives to vote, a linchpin in the struggle for freedom. Charlie Jones was up against a confusing framework of laws which attempted to define citizenship for Native Americans. The Dawes Act of 1887 applied citizenship to Indians who, quote, adopted the habits of civilized life. In 1915, Alaska's territorial legislature attempted to clarify what civilized meant in this case by introducing a battery of tests for an Alaska Native to pass, including a school test, renouncing tribal affiliation, and the endorsement of white men. Right at the beginning of the trial, William Paul scored an early victory when Judge Reed struck down the territorial legislature's law, leaving the Dawes Act intact. William Paul had to prove his client, Charlie Jones, was civilized, and he had a strategy to do it. The government presented its case first, from Sold American by Donald Craig Mitchell. When the trial began, L. M. Churchill and the other prosecution witnesses testified that Jones was an illiterate who took pride in being the successor of Shakes, the traditional chief of Wrangell. They also testified that the defendant lived in an unpainted house in the Indian village. Charlie Jones was, in fact, Chief Shakes VII. He received the honor just a few years before. In later years, Charlie Jones described how it came to be. When Chief Shakes died in 1916, I was chosen by the people of the Nyanyai family to be the new chief. It was the custom, by our tribal law, for the newly chosen chief to pay all the funeral expenses of the late chief, give a feast, and then inhabit the old Shakes community house on Shakes Island. When Shakes died, they sent for me. I was at Ham Island. I came right away. The old lady, Mary Shakes, the chief's widow, told me she was going to leave everything in my hands. The chief was laying there in the house without a coffin, so I bought him a coffin. I got people to dig the grave. I hired people to sit up and watch the body, which is our custom. If Charlie Jones had subjected himself to the citizenship rules written by the territorial legislature, It would have required him to renounce his title as Chief Shakes and all tribal connections. The rules forced Alaska Natives to choose between their ancestry or their citizenship. Loyalty to the United States meant giving up tribal connections. Charlie Jones wasn't on trial. Chief Shakes was. When it was William Paul's turn, he called Charlie Jones to the stand in his own defense. The jury was about to learn a lot more about Charlie Jones. William Paul asked if he sent his children to school. Charlie Jones replied yes, he sent his children to the Bureau of Education school. William Paul asked if Charlie Jones paid his taxes. Charlie Jones replied yes, and he had the receipts to prove it. December 29, 1911, 88 cents. December 23, 1912, $2.25. November 7, 1914, $2.25. December 13, 1917, $3. January 31, 1919, $3. March 6, 1920, $3. March 31, 1922, $4. William Paul asked if Charlie Jones donated to charity. Charlie Jones said yes, that he regularly gave to the Red Cross and purchased Liberty bonds. He told the court, "I give for myself, I give for my wife, I give for my son Richard, and I give for my little dog, Captain Wilson." According to legend, while preparing his questions for Charlie Jones, an exasperated William Paul wondered if he could prove Charlie Jones was civilized by asking him if he ever used toilet paper. This question was never posed in court, though it has been dubbed the toilet paper defense. The attorneys for both sides presented their closing arguments, and Judge Reed sent the jury away with instructions to deliberate. They weighed the question before them. Was Charlie Jones civilized? Did he lead a civilized life? The Ketchikan jury returned with a verdict on both counts. Not guilty. As for Tillie Paul Tamaree, U.S. Attorney Arthur Shoup moved to dismiss the indictment against her immediately. According to William Paul's son, Shoup told William Paul, "I'll never bring a charge like that one again." Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree were free. Chapter 5. Epilogue. When Tillie and her sister were very young and in British Columbia, their mother, Kuthook, fled with her girls from their father. He intended to send the girls to be raised in his native Scotland, against their mother's wishes. Even though their mother was likely fighting tuberculosis, she found and enlisted the aid of a fellow tribal member to paddle a canoe in the stealth of night for 600 miles through treacherous seas and unfriendly territory to the safety of what is today Wrangell. After the voyage, Kuthook tragically succumbed to tuberculosis, with her young daughter, Tillie, curled by her side. Tillie's life had seen great pain, and would see more. The year after the verdict, her youngest daughter, Gladys, passed away from an infection. But Tillie's life had also seen demonstrations of great faith, strength, and conviction. In 1931, Tillie Paul Tamaree was elected to ruling eldership of the Presbyterian Church of the United States. It was an honor rarely bestowed upon women, let alone an indigenous woman from a remote island in Alaska. In 1940, the world came to Shakes Island. America was investing in its unique heritage and rediscovering its love of Native American art and culture. Shakes Island was one of 5 new totem parks in southeast Alaska, paid for by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Officials from Washington, D.C. watched 76-year-old Charlie Jones, Kudinake, Chief Shakes VII, don regalia and perform a traditional dance on Shakes Island in front of totem poles and a clan house he helped carve by hand. Charlie Jones is the last of the Chief Shakes. The election judges and the Wrangell City Council learned the hard way. If you strike at a chief, you better not miss. His life and legacy became a powerful symbol in the movement and beyond. Both Charlie Jones and Tillie Paul Tamaree lived out the rest of their years in Wrangell. In the general election following Charlie Jones's acquittal, William Paul was elected the first Alaska Native member of the territorial legislature, even after the Juneau Daily Empire called him a menace for his work to give natives the vote. Their struggle in Wrangell continued. In 1926, the Wrangell City Council supported a literacy test to vote, an attempt to enshrine the unwritten literacy rule used against Charlie Jones. The Paul brothers crafted a legacy that influenced decades of Alaska Native activism and legislation, including the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. William Paul never became a professional opera singer.
La donna immobile, qual piuma al vento, muta l'aceto, e di pensiero, sempre un'amabile, leggiadro viso, il piano sorriso, e menzognero. La donna immobile, qual piuma al vento, muta l'aceto.
Today's episode contained 5 operas recorded in the 1920s, courtesy of the Internet Archives. The pieces are O del mio dolce ardor, Adina credimi, Carmen Hamanera, I lucevan la stelle, Nessun dorma, and Rigoletto.